I hope everyone is now seeing my slides. All right. Yeah, so thank you again. And I'm happy to be here today to present the first results of my dissertation project about the topic of the methods of political influence of weak interests by using the example of the reform process of the Bundesteilhabegesetz. It's a federal participation act here in Germany. So what do I have planned? First, I want to give you a little overview about the background of my dissertation project, so you know a little bit about where I did get all the ideas of the methods. After this, I'm going to show you some methods of the political influence they used in this reform process, and then there will be a short conclusion. So you can see here a chart I have brought, and some of you may be seeing that I did process tracing in my dissertation, and I identified different phases of the reform process, I want to explain it just shortly because within the framework of the coalition agreement between two parties, it was decided in 2013 to create a new law for people with disabilities. And this reform process was started in 2014 by a working group where even people with disabilities and their associations could participate as well. And later on, there were different draft laws and a lot of comments of the associations of people with disabilities. But because they didn't like what they found in the draft laws, and so there were also a lot of protests, even a conciliation. But in the end, the law was adopted in the end of 2016. And just shortly, the aim of this reform is to improve the self-determination of people with disabilities in German law. By implementing the UN Convention in German law. So to explain and elaborate the assertiveness of the interest groups of people with disabilities, I developed the power resource approach that was originally for unions to weak interests and adapted it to them. And my focus is on how they can represent and assert their interests through a collective mobilization of power resources. They lay the foundation for this presentation today. And to demonstrate how or what methods they actually used. And I'm not sure how much you know about weak interests. Just shortly, weak interests or people with disabilities are weak according to association research, and weak interest experience a relative disadvantage in the political congruence of interests. But even at certain times, people with disabilities and weak interests are able to engage in collective action. And this is what's happening for people with disabilities for quite a long time, actually, in Germany now. So that's just about the background. And now I would like to present the methods of political influence they used in this reform process. And I clustered it in three different, I clustered it. So, and these various methods, or I argue that these methods led to the fact that a part of their demands could be enforced, and they could assert their interests through these methods. The first cluster here are the classics of lobbying, I would call them. These protests and petitions and direct lobbying. And I would like like to start with the protests and so on, because to their concerns in the public. Especially in 2016, there were a lot of protests in the capital of Germany, in Berlin, as well on state level. And because I don't have that much time, I don't go that deep into every protests or a special action they had. But there are these campaigns, or the protests were very closely linked to the use of social media, so protests were called for online, or the actions were documented via Instagram or their own YouTube channels. They used a lot of publicity, and they were professional in the campaigning. And I think that helped them in the end, because there were a lot of protests, a lot of actions, so that they could assert some of their interests in the end. Another classic is a direct lobbying. It's divided into formal and informal communication. And the formal communication is something like that interest groups of people with disabilities were invited to hearings in the parliament, and even the working group I was telling you about at the beginning, I would say something like the formal communication. And the informal communication is something like, for example, there's direct contact between the ministry and the associations of people with disabilities, and so the next methods are special features of this reform process, I would say, and that helped a lot to assert the interests in the end, because first there were special alliances, and maybe some of you would say alliances is something classic for lobbying or for power resources, but there were really some diverse and a lot of alliances on different levels, like there were alliances between various interest groups of people with disabilities among themselves. And there's one alliance, the German Council of People with Disabilities. They existed before the reform process, but they started to work and very closely in this reform process, and they have written a lot of statements together. And the next is the stronger and weaker interests who have joined forces in different alliances. And the first one is in form of a series of statements in which an always identical alliance has bundled their demands. And it was called the 6 Common Core Demands. And so the German Council I've talked about before was involved in this, but even and also in union and 2 different welfare associations. And so they were really they were designed to for a broader mass, so that the public, politicians, and so on could understand what they wanted. And in the end, and I think this is the really important alliance here. In the end, there were 140 supporters who joined these core demands, and there were also other joint papers, and they were increasingly more specific when the reform process got on. And the last of the alliances are statements by associations that have formulated demand papers on a one-off basis, for example, when it came to special issues like education at universities for people with disabilities. The next the next special feature of this reform process were special consultations, also again between the German Council of People with Disabilities, who were also part of this working group. And before and after every meeting of this working group, they started to prepare each other to be a little bit stronger together, and to be a front to other. So they also used different techniques I want to present as well. The first technique is the framing they used, and this means that initiatives should be taken at the right moment, and this is just what took place in just before and during particular decision-making moments, and they use it quite often. And the next is the storytelling, and it's originally from business management research, and it's there to use to sell market products with a special story used for them and what would happen with their lives, and so that the politicians and ministers and so on could understand a little bit easier what would change. And the next is the scandalization of injustice, where so the society should perceive claims as justified, and so individual interest groups of people with disabilities use this to point out injustice in the existing law, and demand that these regulations should be considered in the reform. And it was closely linked to storytelling, because it is nicer to have injustice and a story. Where demand papers are very short, and where the very most important contents should be presented in an understandable and brief manner. And for example, something like this was the 6 common core demands, so that politicians and so on could understand it a little bit easier, what people with disabilities wanted in this reform process. And with that, I am now at the conclusion. What it has shown that interest groups of people with disabilities are quite able to apply different methods to assert their interests, or some of their interests. But I just focused so far just on the generalized terms about the interest groups of people with disabilities, but the group of people with disabilities are very heterogeneous. So there are different subgroups of people with disabilities. And on the one hand, for example, there are people who need high support, who need a lot of assistance, who may be bedridden. On the other hand, there are people like there is an association that is called Lawyers with Disabilities, and they have other resources than people who are just bedridden and need high support. I argue that there are stronger weak interests and weak interests still in the big group of people with disabilities. And I had only, or there was only a part of the associations who could really actively lobby and use different power like I've shown you. And for all those who are not able to stand up for their own interests independent, this is something that Katrin already said in her presentation, that people who are not able to assert their own interest, that there's always the advocacy who is trying to assert their interests. So what does it mean for other processes? So firstly, like I've shown, individual associations of people with disabilities are quite capable of using methods of political influence, but these are only the stronger weak interests. And even they can use the support of the advocacy in form of alliances, for example, like it's happened here in this reform process. But especially for people who are not able to articulate themselves, like the weak interest, the advocacy continues to be an important resource. And so this still gives a central role to the advocacy associations in reform processes to enable and empower people with disabilities or the weak interests to participate in political processes. But I think that even the stronger weak interests are able to empower weak interests, and that they could help weak interests in further or other political processes more, because in this reform process, they were focusing on themselves, and so they said it was more the role of the advocacy to look after the weak interests in this part. And I think they are stronger, and they may be able to empower strong weak interests as well. Yeah. And so I'm now at the end of the presentation, and thank you very much for your attention. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion.